Hello, welcome to the second episode of Podclass, and this is the podcast series in our subject in Assessment in Learning 1. And once again, this is your teacher broadcaster greeting you good morning if you're listening this in the morning, and good afternoon if you're listening this in the afternoon. Mr. Brian M. Lazaleda on the air. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we shall be starting our week with a new lesson to discuss, and that is on target setting. This is our second unit in our subject, and on Monday I have uploaded already the module that you will read for the next 4 weeks. And this episode we shall be discussing the first topic of this unit, and that is on standards-based assessment. Well, just a backgrounder of our lesson for today, we know that one of the 12 principles of high-quality assessment is the clarity of learning targets, and that's actually the first thing or the first quality that we have to take in mind when we are on the process of developing and designing our assessment strategies. That is clarity of learning targets, and that's why we dedicated one unit to actually teach you, future teachers or pre-service teachers, how to set targets in our classroom, because these are actually very important for us to understand, because our learning targets, like our learning objectives or outcomes, well, these terms are very different from each other. But as we go on, okay, we will realize that our learning objectives are actually our guide to many aspects of our teaching endeavor, not only in the choice of our assessment strategies, but on how we deal with our classroom in itself, how we deal with assessments with teaching strategies, techniques and methods, and of course our learning materials. And all of this stuff all together, they all based on our objectives. And that's why it's important that we know, and you know as pre-service teacher, how to know or how to make or write a lesson objective. And we will be dealing with that as we proceed with the next topics in this unit. But in this episode, we shall be focusing our attention to the first topic at hand, which is standards-based assessment. At the end of this episode, you are expected to describe standards-based assessment, to explain the characteristics of constructive alignment, and of course to describe the K-12 assessment guidelines along content standards, performance standards, and assessment types. And before we proceed, I always remind you that you have to take hold of your module while you're actually listening to the second episode of our podcast. In this way, you will be able to highlight or to take down the important points that I will be mentioning in our episode, because well, most likely those things that I would emphasize are the things that will be coming out in your quiz tomorrow. That's on Friday. Friday is quiz day, and please anticipate for a test code to be uploaded tomorrow. But again, you will be given 4 days window period to actually finish the quiz, right? And of course, for your examination, for your midterm examination. So hold your modules and follow my instructions, okay, while holding your modules, so that you would know what to highlight and what to underline maybe in your module. Okay, so let's talk about standards-based assessment. We have this topic in your unit 1 already on the last topic, but in this particular episode, we shall be expounding the concepts underlying standards-based assessment. Okay, so standards-based assessment allows us to make judgments about the level of an individual's learning with respect to shared benchmarks of expected performance supported by exemplars. Okay, but let me remind you that this may sound like the criterion reference assessment, but it's not. All right, it's not. Standards-based assessment is broader in its meaning compared with criterion reference assessment. Why? Because the scope of the point of reference is wider than a criterion reference assessment, and we'll have to talk about that later. Okay, so it is a type of assessment that makes direct and extensive use of teachers' qualitative judgments Okay? It requires external, visible standards for the use of both teachers and students, defined by exemplars and verbal description. So when we talk about exemplars, these are from the word example. Okay, these are examples of performance outputs. So, in other words, you want to show your students an example of what they are expected to produce, okay? What they are expected to create. And these exemplars will provide them guidelines or reference points towards what they're gonna do so that they will have something in mind na alam nila kung ano yung gagawin nila. So, it's a standards-based assessment, okay, defined by exemplars and verbal descriptions. These verbal descriptions could take in many forms at many levels, okay? It could be performance outcomes, it could be lesson objectives, or national competencies. So, it depends really. So, that's what I'm talking about between criterion reference assessment and standards-based assessment. Standards-based assessment has a wider scope because it has certain verbal descriptions or standards at many levels. But for criterion reference assessment, we look at certain standards set in the classroom alone. So that might be the lesson objective on that particular day. All right. So well, we know if you are immersed already with the K-12 curriculum, well, not yet because you are still on your second year, but starting fourth year, you will begin immersing yourself in the environment of a real classroom in the basic education, particularly in high school. And you will soon realize what I'm trying to point out here, what we're trying to learn here on standards-based assessment, because this is consistent with the K-12 curriculum being implemented today and then for the next years. I don't know when will this be changed, but we expect that these things will be changing because nothing is really permanent. Okay, so it is consistent with the K-12 curriculum as it emphasizes on assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. And you have to internalize that, okay? Standards-based assessment has emphasis on assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. As you will see later, the components of the K-12 grading system puts into a larger account the performance task of students. Okay, so it's not really dealing more on the summative results of the assessment procedure, but it deals on things that could actually force the learner to learn. Okay, that assessment strategies dealt on assessment for learning. Okay, so this new paradigm calls for deep changes both in teachers' perceptions of their own role in relation to their students and in their classroom practice. In other words, people, as early as now, we have to change our mindset that we are assessing because we want to know if students really learned. That should not be our ultimate goal. But we have to assess because we want to help our learners learn. We want to help our learners improve their ability, their skills, their values, and their attitude. Okay? So we don't only design quizzes, we don't only design exams just because we want to know if they really learned. But we want to design assessment strategies that would give us ideas on their progress, and knowing their progress would give us opportunity to design intervention programs that would help them or that would reinforce their learning. That's the purpose of a standards-based assessment. It's not really dealing more on assessment of learning, but it's on assessment for learning. But unfortunately, many teachers does not actually realize that. And most of those, okay, I must say that most of the teachers you have been under with, okay, are focused on assessing what you learned because it's for grading purposes, but not actually on improving the teaching and learning process. Okay, so we have to look at that. That is the philosophy of standards-based assessment. So looking at the page, this is page 40 for page 5, okay, page 5 of your Unit 2 on target setting, um, the three type of assessment here are differentiated. That's norm reference assessment, criterion reference assessment, and standards based assessment. And as I have mentioned a while ago, these three are really different from each other. Okay, we have discussed already what norm reference assessment and criterion reference assessment are in our previous discussions, and I think there's no need for me to discuss anymore what these two type of assessments are. Okay, but I just mentioned a while ago that criterion reference assessment and standards based assessment are somehow similar, but standards based assessment has a wider scope. Okay, it has broad descriptions. Okay, compared to criterion reference assessment. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of standards based assessment. Okay, I will just pick two of these benefits, and then these are pretty self-explanatory. Knowing already the definition of standards based assessment, you will realize these benefits of this kind of assessment. Okay, so it provides much richer information about what you expect your students to achieve, but by describing what they need to know and what they can actually do. Okay, so by showing them exemplars, okay, you are giving them concrete examples or concrete descriptions of what they are expected to do in the class and what they are expected to learn in the class. Okay, it provides more explicit guidance to students, as what I have mentioned, and similar to criterion reference assessment, you're using criteria, you're using a standard to give more efficient feedback to students about their performance. Okay, and lastly, to provide guidance to students about what's important in their learning and assessment, and encourages them to understand the goals and standards in order to study towards them, and fosters grading consistency over time. All right, so that's a backgrounder of standards-based assessment. In the K-12 curriculum, it highlights the notion that learner constructs their own learning through relevant learning activities. And we learned that just yesterday on educational technology, on the theories of educational technology. We call that constructivism. Okay, so thus the teacher's job is to create a learning environment that supports the learning activities appropriate to achieving the desired learning outcomes. Okay, and the key to all these components is knowing the curriculum, okay, and its intended outcomes. As teachers, we should know what the curriculum is and what are the learning outcomes on that particular curriculum, the teaching methods that is suitable for the learning outcomes, for the course intended outcomes, and the assessment tasks that are aligned together. Okay, so our subject in the curriculum has outcomes. They have learning outcomes. And one thing about learning outcomes is that it gives us ideas on what teaching methods should we use. And of course, what are the assessment tasks that we should select to achieve the learning outcomes. In other words, what we're trying to do here is we are putting a straight line that connects the curriculum, the teaching method, and the assessment task. We call that, ladies and gentlemen, as constructive alignment. Okay? So constructive alignment, ladies and gentlemen, is a teaching principle under constructivism. The idea is, okay, through the learning outcomes that we set in our class, we will be able that the learners will be able to construct or create meaning out of their learning activities, and these learning activities must be aligned with the intended learning outcomes. That's constructive alignment. All right, so Biggs has defined this, and you will see it in the box, okay, in page number 6. Okay, he said that constructive alignment is the coherence between assessment, teaching strategies, and intended learning outcomes in an educational program. And you will see this in the figure at the bottom of the page in page 6. Okay, you will see the intended learning outcomes. Okay, the assessment strategies, assessment regime termed here, and the teaching and learning activities. So the outcomes must be followed, okay, by the assessment task, which the assessment task should meet the learning outcomes, and and also, okay, the teaching and learning activities must also be based on the intended learning outcomes. All right, so this is the idea of bigs, okay, formulated by Tyler. But at some point, okay, what happens here is that we don't design the assessment task after learning the outcomes. Most of the times, teachers actually select the teaching and learning activities after the learning outcomes, then followed by the assessment task. Okay, if we look at the lesson plans, okay, if we look at examples of lesson plans in the Department of Education, you would always see the evaluation part at the bottom or at the last part of the lesson plan. Okay, and the outcomes sa unahan ng lesson plan. That would suggest to us, okay, to you as pre-service teachers, that the number one thing that we have to consider when we're trying to write our lesson plan are the learning objectives, and then followed by our teaching and learning activities, then lastly, our assessment task or evaluation. Doon natin nakikita yung constructive alignment na sinasabi ni Briggs. Okay? So in the next page, in page 7, you will see an example of constructive alignment here happening in the curriculum. So for example, your learning outcome is to monitor, evaluate, and reflect on your teaching and the learning of your students. That's the learning outcome, and the assessment will be observation cycle. Could be a reflective statement of personal and professional gain. So it's like a journaling system. Okay, and the teaching learning activities will be introductory group tutorial, revision of critical reflection theory, or it could be a seminar. Okay, that would really meet our objective, that to monitor, evaluate, and reflect on your teaching and the learning of your students. Well, in a contextualized an example for your major, you are majoring in MAPE, and if you are teaching basic skills in softball, okay, and that's your learning outcome. You want your students to demonstrate the basic skills in softball. That's your learning outcome. What would be your assessment task? Well, you expected that you would choose performance-based assessment there. You would actually have them demonstrate the basic skills in softball. But in the teaching and learning activity, how would you do that? Okay, so you will use demonstrations, you will use video lessons, or maybe peer tutoring, or maybe resource persons. You will invite a professional softball player in the class, and he or she will be demonstrating the basic skills in softball. Those are the teaching and learning activities, and you can see there the alignment between the learning outcomes to the assessment tasks, to the teaching and learning activities. And that's we want to do. Okay, that's what we want to do in the next sessions. If you are with me in educational technology or in technology for teaching and learning, okay, I will be asking you, okay, my students, to actually demonstrate a particular lesson in their field of specialization. And I would like to see how these are aligned together, okay, how these three elements in teaching and learning are aligned together, because that is very important. Okay? So, in page 8, ito yung sinasabi natin na minsan hindi naman natin fina-follow yung sequence na yung learning outcomes muna, tapos yung assessment task, tapos yung teaching and learning activities. Actually, what we do is that we look at the outcomes, we think of our teaching and learning activities, and then followed by the assessment task. Okay? So, in the figure in page number page number 8, okay, you will see that the teaching and learning activities can be teacher controlled. Okay, teacher controlled meaning you are the pasimuno. Ikaw mismo yung main character doon sa activity nila. So this can take form like when you're trying to do a lecture, when you're trying to do a demonstration, or maybe um, a facilitated group work, for example. Peer controlled, pwede. When there are group dynamics, when there's peer tutoring, so you are only the facilitator there. And self-controlled when you're dealing with individualized instruction. Okay, so those are the teaching and learning activities that you could actually implement. Okay, but these are general categories. You have to still learn what are the different teaching and learning activities. And I think you should have learned that in principles of teaching. Okay, and what are the different teaching approaches, teaching strategies that you could actually employ in your classroom. Okay, and then the assessment tasks or marking criteria need to differentiate between these levels. Okay, kung ano yung the very best understanding, ano yung highly satisfactory, ano yung quite satisfactory, ano yung just a pass. Okay, you should be able to differentiate these levels, and you can do that by using a rubric. Okay, a rubric, and that will be our topic in the next discussions. Okay, so this can be achieved by using verbs associated with the higher levels of a learning taxonomy. Okay, we'll do that in the next lesson, and we'll have that in the next episode of our podcast. Paano tayo magsulat ng objectives? Okay, paano ano yung mga ini-expect nating parts ng objectives? All right. So the goal of constructive alignment then is to support students in developing as much meaning and learning as possible from a well-designed, coherent, and aligned course. Okay, courses are congruent and cohere in an explicit way when there is good fit and flow between a course's intended learning outcomes, teaching and learning activities, and assessments of student learning. Okay, so in a nutshell, yun lang ang ibig sabihin ng constructive alignment na isang katangian ng standards-based assessment. Okay? Kasi, pag kayo ay nagturo na sa public school, pag kayo graduate na, takapasa na kayo ng licensure exam, and you are now employed in a public school, you are expected to know what a curriculum guide is because yun ang gagamitin mo. The national government, through the Department of Education, has already rolled out yung mga curriculum guide para sa teachers. Itong mga curriculum guide na ito, meron na itong intended learning outcomes. Okay? Meron na intended learning outcomes ito at hindi mo na kailangan gumawa pa. Okay? But it is expected that from these intended learning outcomes, you have to think of assessment strategies and teaching and learning activities that are aligned with these intended learning outcomes. Okay? In the application of our subject, I will introduce to you kung ano yung tinatawag nating curriculum guide para sa mga guro. Okay? So, as developed by John Briggs, constructive alignment involves thoughtfully determining intentions for what students should learn through the learning outcomes, of course, and you have to clearly communicate that with your learners, what they are expected to finish, what they are expected to do. Okay? Designing teaching and learning activities and creating assessments that will allow students to demonstrate their attainment of the learning outcomes. Okay, so talking about this, okay, and I've been introducing to you that standards-based assessment and constructive alignment can be seen on the features of the K-12 curriculum. Okay, we'll talk about the K-12 assessment guidelines, okay? So you can see the K-12 assessment guidelines. If you have your internet after this session, you may want to Google DepEd Order number 8, series of 2015, okay? And you can see there the guidelines on how to assess students in the K-12 curriculum. Once again, that's DepEd Order number 8, series of 2015, and that was passed 2 years after the implementation of the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013, or Republic Act number 10533. Okay, yung K-12 curriculum na sinasabi natin. So, as per indicated in the guidelines, okay, assessment in the classroom aims at helping students perform well in relation to the learning standards. And these learning standards has three types, okay? Tandaan natin to, no? Learning standards comprises three. What are these three? Number one, content standards. Number two, performance standards. Number three, learning competencies. At ano-ano itong mga tatlong ito? What are content standards? What are performance standards? And what are learning competencies? Now, what are content standards? First and foremost. Content standards are what you're gonna teach, okay? Or in more politically correct question, that is, what should the learners know? Ano yung kailangan nilang matutunan? Yun yung tinatawag nating content standards. Okay? Kung ano yung specified scope or sequential topics within each learning strand, domain, theme, or component. Okay? So in other words, ito yung subject matter. Ano yung kailangang matutunan ng mga estudyante mo? Tawag natin doon content standards. Followed by content standards are performance standards. And what are performance standards? These describe the abilities and skills that learners are expected to demonstrate in relation to the content standards and integration of 21st century skills. So performance standards answer these questions. What can learners do with what they know? Anong pwede nilang gawin sa nalaman na nila? Okay? How well must learners do their work? How well do learners use their learning or understanding in different situations? How do learners apply their learning or understanding in real-life context? What tools and measures should learners use to demonstrate what they have already known? So in other words, people, when we talk about the performance standards, these are what should the learners do in order to show their teacher or their peers that they learned the content standards. Okay? So performance standards shows how the learners can use the content standards from the word performance. In other words, that learners here are expected to perform something. Okay, so those are the performance standards. I will show you an example later on. All right. So what about learning competencies? Okay, what about learning competencies? Well, learning competencies, people, are the knowledge, understanding, skills, and attitudes that students need to demonstrate in every lesson and or learning activities. You might get confused, so parang parehas naman sila sa performance standards. No. Why? Because performance standards is like a demonstration of their overall learning. But for learning competencies, ano yung competencies na dapat meron ang bata? Okay, yung knowledge, anong understanding, anong skill, anong attitude ang dapat nilang i-demonstrate in every lesson yan. Okay, in every lesson. So it's like it has a narrower concept. Okay, it has a narrower area compared with performance standards. Okay? Yun yung tinatawag nating learning competencies. Maari natin siyang ihalin tulad doon sa ating learning objectives. Okay? So yun yung hierarchy niya, no? Mas malawak ang performance standards kesa sa learning competencies. In fact, the performance standards or the learning competencies are based on the performance standards. All right? So let's look an example of these three inclusions or three elements of learning standards in the K-12 curriculum. For example, this is a topic in English, okay? This is from Module 9 of the Philippine Professional Standards for Teachers, published in 2017. Well, the content standards are: the learner demonstrates understanding how Anglo-American literature and other text types serve as a means of enhancing the self, how to use processing, assessing, summarizing information, word derivation and formation strategies, appropriate word order, punctuation marks, and interjection to enable him or her to participate actively in a speech choir. So dito, nakita nyo kung ano nga ba ang dapat matutunan. What should the learners know? Okay, so they have to demonstrate understanding on Anglo-American literature. All right? And then followed by the performance standards. The performance standards goes this way: the learner actively participate in a speech choir through using effective verbal and non-verbal strategies based on the following criteria: focus, voice, delivery, facial expression, body movements, gestures, and audience contact. So what is the performance that is expected from the learner? Participation in the speech choir. That's performance standards. But if you look at the learning competency under this week, okay, distinguish between and among informative, journalistic, and literary writing. You see here, friends, that, kung i-compare natin ang content standards, performance standards, at learning competencies, yung content standards, yun yung pinaka nasa taas, okay? And then we deduce it to the performance standards, and then further deduce to the learning competencies. So yun yung example natin ng learning standards of the K-12 curriculum. You will see more of this, okay, if you download already the curriculum course guide or curriculum guide in the DepEd for junior high school. And junior high school muna tayo on MAPE kasi walang MAPE ang senior high school. What they have is HOPE. Okay, so for this time, we focus our attention on the curriculum guide in junior high school. Okay, so yes, that's an example of the learning standards in the K-12 curriculum. So you will see more examples in the curriculum guide. And if you don't still understand yet yung anong pagkakaiba ng tatlong ito, you can go to Google, download the curriculum guide, and you will see there are many examples in MAPE. Okay? So that's for the learning standards. Now, let's talk about concept development. Okay, concept development. The learning standards in curriculum reflect progressions of concept development. Ano ito? The cognitive process dimensions adopted from Anderson and Cratwell may be a good way to operationalize these progressions. Okay? May progression kasi yan. Hindi pwedeng hindi mataas na tapos hindi mo pa nagawa yung baba. So merong mababa papunta sa mataas, okay? So to align the assessment process with the K-12 curriculum, the adopted cognitive process dimensions may be used as guide not only in lesson development but also in the formation of assessment tasks. So ano-ano itong mga ito? Ano ba itong mga cognitive processes na ito from basic to complex? Well, we have remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Well, you can see this already in the Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive domain. This is actually the revised one. Okay, the revised one. Okay. So, in the K-12 curriculum, we have different assessment types, which you can see in page number 10, okay, of your module. Na pag-usapan na rin natin kung ano-ano itong mga ito, naulit lang din, like formative assessment. These are assessment happening during instruction. It could be before or during instruction with the aim of helping our learners improve their understanding of the lesson. So examples of these are written exercises, performances, models, and even electronic presentations. So you can use formative assessment in different parts of the lesson. Okay. We also have summative assessment, and we know for a fact that summative assessment happens after the instruction, and these are used for grading purposes of our learners. We have individual and collaborative summative assessment. So, pwede kang magkaroon ng summative assessment na individual at pwede rin siyang collaborative through group activities. Okay? So, there are three components of summative assessment in the K-12 curriculum, and you have to take note of that. What are these three? One, written work. Okay, written work. Two, performance tasks. Okay, and the third one is quarterly assessment. Okay, what are these three? Written work component ensures that students are able to express skills and concepts in written form. So examples of these are quizzes, unit tests, long tests, okay? But these are cognitive assessment procedures, okay? So yan yung written work in written form, okay? And also, yung essays kasama din sa written works yan, written reports, and other written output. Okay? Yung performance task naman, which is the highest among these three components of summative assessment in the K-12 curriculum, allows learners to show what they know and are able to do in diverse ways. So they may create or innovate products or do performance-based tasks. So what are examples of these? Demonstration, group presentations, oral work, multimedia presentations, and research projects. Okay? And then we have quarterly assessment. Ito yung parang periodic exam. Okay? Well, you know, you are K-12 graduates. You should know this. Okay? So yung mga quarterly assessment nyo, this could be in many forms. Hindi lang to written works, pwede din siyang performance-based task, okay? Or pwede ring objective test. Pero most of the time, teachers would always design objective tests but do not really cling on the idea of performance-based assessment. Kasi, you know, we cannot blame them. Mahirap mag-grade and administer ng performance-based assessment. And but we would always do objective tests, ipa-administer mo lang, check it, and there's it. Andun na yung grade mo, andun na yung score mo. Okay? Pero as MAPE teachers, katulad nyo, kayo, because the nature of the subject does not really focus on objective tests, but more on performance-based assessment. Okay? So those are the three components of the summative assessment in the K-12: written work, performance task, and quarterly assessment. Okay? So lahat ng ito, they should all be reflected in your class records. Okay? So that's it. That's our topic 1 in our unit 2 in target setting. That's on standards-based assessment. So generally, our standards in the standards-based assessment are the learning standards in the K-12 curriculum. So we have to look at the curriculum guide in MAPE when we are teaching. I hope that this was introduced to you already in your principles of teaching subject, but if not, then you have to do that. You have to go to Google and look at examples of learning standards in the curriculum guide in MAPE. Okay, what are these learning standards? We have content standards, performance standards, then followed by the learning competency. As your assignment, okay? As your assignment, you have to go back in my post in our Facebook social learning group, okay? There, okay, yung post ko sa Podclass episode na ito, mag-comment kayo ng example ng content standard, ng performance standard, at saka learning competency. Okay? I repeat, mag-comment kayo ng content standard, ng performance standard, at saka ng learning competency. That's your assignment for this particular topic in unit number 2. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for once again joining us in our second episode of Podclass on standards-based assessment. On the next episode, we shall be talking about the Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive domain, and that's a very good topic and a very important topic also that you have to attend to. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Once again, this is your teacher broadcaster, Mr. Brian M. Nozaleda, signing off in our second episode of Podclass. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.